Sir. I think colleagues in the House will know well by now that Labor is, would be supporting this bill if the government was willing to entertain the supplementary order paper that Trevor Mallard, the Honourable Trevor Mallard, has placed on the table, Sir, pruning back the urgency powers that this bill would give to the Honourable Murray McCulley, which is a worry to everybody on this side of the House. That minister, if anybody, should not be given the kind of urgency powers that this bill extends. Sir, and we're going to talk generally about Part 1, Sir, and thank you for your advice about that. My colleague Trevor Mallard has pointed out that Clause 3 2C 2 empowers the Minister, subject to a recommendation of the authority, to grant urgent approvals for activities and facilities in circumstances of urgency that, for good reason, were not foreseen. And that's a very interesting phrase right there, Sir, that this bill empowers the Minister subject to a recommendation of the authority. Well, as we're going to find out as we go into more detail in this debate, Sir, the Minister is not subject, his powers are not subject to a recommendation of the authority. This bill explicitly gives him the power to override, to ignore the recommendations and the advice of the authority that's set up by this bill, Sir. And that is the objection that we have. And if it were not for this issue, we would be supporting this bill, in spite of the problems that my Green colleague David Clendon has set out with this legislation. Labor is of the view that this legislation is needed, that the risks and the benefits of this mega event for New Zealand are such that we cannot afford to put them at risk, that the scale of the event is so big that we're going to be reliant, because of the influx of visitors for this event, they are going to be reliant on a great deal of temporary infrastructure, and it's necessary for the regulatory framework to allow expeditious processing, not only of consents, resource consents, building consents, but also in the area of liquor licensing. Now, we're going to come back later in this debate and spend a great deal of time talking about the Murray McCulley provisions, as they will undoubtedly become known. In the meantime, let's look at the general purpose of the Act, Clause 3, the purpose and overview. The purpose is, the bill says, to enable applications to be determined expeditiously for activities or facilities reasonably necessary for the proper conduct of the Rugby World Cup. Now, before me, colleagues have pointed out that there was a lot of discussion in the Select Committee that is reflected in the interpretation clauses here, that ancillary events, that's a needed distinction, to say that events like live public screenings, like those that will be taking place down on Queen's Wharf under a cloud, will be considered to be Rugby World Cup events, and in that they will be subject to all the same kind of provisions that this bill extends to the big games. So it's not just the games themselves, sporting events, but also all the other associated times and places where people get together to celebrate the event or watch the games on a big screen. We've also heard some discussion, Sir, about the limits to the application of the Building Act, and in Auckland particularly, the influx of visitors is going to mean that multi-storey, high-rise apartment buildings will be pressed into service to house many of the, I think, between 65 and 85,000 visitors that are expected to flood into the country for this event, and they will need to be housed, and it's very likely that high-rise apartment buildings are going to be used, and if they were to be treated as accommodation...
Call Nikki Kay.